Louisa May Alcott, she once said, "We have our lives to pursue, our own kind of dreams to be weaving. We all have the power to make our dreams come true, only if we believe in it." Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I present to you the first lecture of Techfest 2012. Techfest 2012 lecture series strives to bring you eminent personalities giving insightful enlightenment on exotic topics. And today we have in our midst Dr. Deirdre Barrett to grace us and share a vast knowledge on the art and the mastery of dreaming. The lucid dreaming is what a man always wants to control. You want to control, don't you all want to be the person who controls the dream like the movie Inception? Dr. Deirdre Barrett is a psychologist on Harvard Medical. She is known for her research on dreams, hypnosis and imagery and has written Evolutionary Psychology. Professor Barrett is best known for her works on dream and the contribution to creativity and objective problem solving. She has interviewed modern artists and scientists about the use of dreams, documenting dramatic anecdotes, including Nobel Prizes, whose ideas originated in the dreams. She has also conducted research asking college students to incubate answers to real-life homework and other objective problems on which they were working, and also discovered a huge rate of success. For many years, students at Harvard and elsewhere have known Professor Barrett for the clarity and quality of her lectures and her engaging style. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a huge round of applause for Dr. Barrett.
I wanted to open with a story that I was told soon after moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Even though Cambridge is a small town, we have Harvard, my university, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology are in the same town. And a man I met soon after moving there, Don Newman, who's a mathematician, told me about his early days at MIT when he worked alongside rising star and Nobel laureate to be John Nash. And the main important point in this story is that he thought of John Nash as just the most brilliant mathematician he knew who could sort of do anything. And Don Newman was trying to solve a particular math problem which he'd set himself to and been working on for a number of weeks without really getting anywhere. He said, "I was trying to solve it and I couldn't, and I just couldn't." And one night, Newman had a dream, and in the dream, he was continuing to think about this particular mathematical problem in a similar way to how he did awake. And John Nash walked into the room in the dream. And so Newman related the details of this problem that he was working on to Nash and asked Nash if he knew the answer to it, still within the dream. So Nash explained the solution to him, and Newman woke up and realized that this was indeed the correct solution, and spent the next couple of weeks writing it out in detail, turning the insight into a formal paper, which he sent off to Mathematics Journal, where it was published. And Newman told me that a couple decades ago, and has sadly since died. He was a rather old man at the time he told me the story. But much more recently, I happened to meet John Nash at a dinner party, and I asked him about that story, and he chuckled and recalled it, and he said yes, he certainly remembered Newman telling him about it at the time, and that in fact Newman had thanked him in a footnote in the article when it was published for Nash's help in the dream. He never asked him about it awake, but he said that he just continued to be grateful to Nash for showing up in his dream and solving this problem, which is a point that I'll return to throughout this talk, that when people get this sort of dramatic help in dreams, it's often projected off onto some figure that they think of as wiser than themselves, and also then they don't always completely feel like they own it. But Newman is hardly alone in having been helped by a dream. The French surrealist poet St. Paul Bou used to hang a sign on his bedroom door at night which read, "Poet at work," as he slept. And John Steinbeck expressed a similar sentiment when he said, "Sometimes a problem is too difficult by day and I give it to the committee of sleep, and in the morning the answer is there." And I actually titled one of my books about dreams, "The Committee of Sleep," because I think it's such a good term for our unconscious in general, but especially dreams, that it's not all one type of thinking. There's certain theories of dreams where dreams are all wise, or dreams are coming from some very primitive infantile part of ourself. But I think that really our unconscious in general, and dreams in particular, are just literally all those parts of ourselves that don't reach consciousness while our sort of usual linear logical reasoning mind is in charge, and that all sorts of disparate kinds of parts of ourselves that the word committee is a good analogy for show up in dreams. And certainly, I believe that the major concerns of dreams are our personal issues, childhood slights, getting along with people, our moods. But since virtually everyone else's dream research is focused on that, I've gotten very interested in the fact that dreams do sometimes do things like I was just recounting in the Newman anecdote, and focus in on very practical problems, including scientific or mathematical ones, and solve them for us. So usually when I study and talk about help from dreams, a lot of the content is in the arts, and I just want to go through some of the artistic examples really briefly in this setting, and then focus more on the sort of science engineering examples that are probably closer to what all of you do. But there are more in the visual arts than any other area because of dreams being so overwhelmingly visual. Anthropologists think that likely some of the more surreal drawings in the Lascaux caves, which were done 10,000 to 40,000 years ago, they're the oldest known examples of human art. And many of them are just obviously realistic things, hunters chasing animals and hunting. But some of them have fantastic elements, people with birds' heads, or like this one where the humanoid figure appears to have some sort of antlers. And anthropologists think that these more magical looking ones at least may represent drawings of dreams that people did. And of course, dreams don't have to be as different from usual to lend themselves to being drawn, but artists still appreciate the inspiration. The surrealists especially were very explicitly looked to their dreams for inspiration. This is Salvador Dali's The Dream Approaches. This is Paul Nash's Landscape from a Dream. Leonora Carrington's painting titled Crookley Hall of a Recurring Nightmare, which she had her entire life. She grew up in this manor house in England, and by 18 had moved to Mexico, which she much preferred, but her recurring nightmare was of trying to get out of her childhood home with all of these spooks chasing her. And this is Leonora Carrington's And Then We Met the Daughter of the Minotaur. All of these are just straight from dreams that she had. Another surrealist, Remedios Varo, also painted from her dreams. This is her The Invention of Birds. And this is Varo's Mooncatcher. And then 3 years ago, architect Solange Fabio had decided that she wanted to enter the competition to be the architect for France's upcoming Museum of Ocean and Surf. But she hadn't started the actual work on her design when she fell asleep and had a dream that she was in a rectangular building, kind of simple, modern style with very regular walls, except overhead the ceiling was blue and swooped in a shape, and she started looking at the strange ceiling shape and realized that it was a wave and that she was under a gigantic ocean wave. And so she woke up, and this is a computer model of the design for the building that she did. White, all the angles are right angles except for the big sweeping ceiling, which also shows up from the outside. Now this is after she won the competition with that design, and they're starting to build it. This is the museum in progress. And then I think my last one is a finished from the outside. The wave is blue inside, but just wave shaped on the surface of it. So she submitted and won the competition for this design that was pretty much the building she was walking around in her dream. The novel Frankenstein had its origin in a dream. Mary Shelley had sat around at bedtime telling ghost stories with Lord Byron and with her husband to be Percy Bysshe Shelley and a couple of other people. And at bedtime, Lord Byron challenged them that they should all write their own ghost story, and he really meant over the next few weeks or months, not that night. But that was the last thing said, and Mary Shelley went to bed and dreamed the two key scenes of Frankenstein, the one where the monster is first created, but in that scene, as you may recall, the scientist doesn't know that the monster actually has come to life. He thinks it's failed. And then the second key scene is when the inventor's gone to bed thinking the experiment's a failure and wakes up with the Frankenstein monster standing over him, clearly alive. So those were the two scenes that she dreamed. And then very similarly, Robert Louis Stevenson dreamed the two key scenes of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which are both the first one in which he invents and takes the potion that changes him, and then the key scene where he's trying to change back as he's always been able to, and the potion no longer facilitates that, and Mr. Hyde is sort of permanently loosed in the world. Another novelist who's made a lot of use of dreams is, I'm probably, for this crowd, not going to do justice to the pronunciation. Bharati Makjiri is an Indian-American novelist who writes mostly about Indian immigrants to the United States. And she says that almost all of her stories and books, she plots out the novel, she has the idea, she thinks she knows how the plot is going to go, and then she will have a dream that changes the ending. So it's almost always just the ending that's dreamed in her book. And almost always her original plot is much more conventional, and the ending is the less expected, less socially acceptable. For example, in a short story called Wife, is about an immigrant couple where the husband is somewhat harsh and abusive, but he's adjusting well to being in America, and his wife is very, very unhappy with America and with his treatment of her. And in the original version, she was going to have the wife kill herself at the end of the short story. And then she had a dream where she saw her two characters in their apartment and was watching them. And after the wife had served her husband breakfast, instead of going off to her bedroom and committing suicide the way she had planned in the plot, the wife took a huge butcher knife and stabbed the husband, who bled to death, into a cereal. And that was how she ended the story. And it's almost always a change in the assertive direction. But another one of a novel which owes its ending to one of these dreams, a little bit less extreme, is one called Jasmine. And a composer named Shirish Karde, also an Indian immigrant to the United States, decided that he wanted to make a musical opera version of Jasmine, rather more fantastic than the plot of the book. And he decided, he'd read the book, he decided that this was going to be his next musical project, and he hadn't started writing the music when he had a dream in which he was seeing the characters from Jasmine moving, with both music was actually playing in the dream, and then also he was seeing colors changing in ways. Synesthesia is the usual term for sort of seeing music as a color. So it was happening both in that synesthetic way and also directly music as stylized versions of the events. And blues mean one thing to him in terms of tones. So this is a scene that was that way. Reds mean something else. So this was another scene. So he heard and saw a lot of what he later staged. And his opera is called Rasa, but it's based on Jasmine. And he didn't actually know that Jasmine was partially based on a dream until I told him that detail. So it permeated both versions of the story. And a number of significant pieces of music have been heard in dreams. Paul McCartney dreamed Yesterday, which actually has a very different sound than many of the Beatles pieces, almost a more traditional sort of music, less hard rock than what they were playing at the time. But he, on the Help tour, he was sleeping back at his mother's house, and he awakened from a dream where he heard the music of Yesterday playing, and he woke up and got up to his old piano and started playing it. And he said that for a couple of weeks he went around asking people if they knew that tune. He was so afraid that he'd heard it somewhere else and just remembered it. And they go, no, that's really good, but I've never heard that. So eventually he owned it, wrote it down, and had the Beatles perform it. Billy Joel says that all of his music occurs to him in dreams. He makes up the lyrics later, but he hears the music itself. Anyway, so lots and lots of the arts are inspired by dreams because dreams are so very visual. The visual art's #1, and because most dreams have narratives and emotional dramatic interactions. Fiction seems to get the second most help, as related things like film and plays do. But for this audience, I want to switch track back to the scientific because it's a little more surprising to the average person, maybe not to you because maybe many of you have had the experience, that dreams, even though we characterize them on average as so illogical and bizarre, can often have directly practical things to science and math and technology and invention. One example from biology was a woman named Margie Prophet, who says that when she was about 10 or 11 years old, and I have no idea if this is anything the same, what the equivalent here is, but in the United States, when children are sort of just pre-puberty, they separate the boys and the girls, and they give them this talk telling them sort of where babies come from and what's about to happen to changes in your body and all of this kinds of things. And I'm not quite sure what they tell the boys. I never got that talk, but I got the same talk that Margie got. And the girls' talk it's mostly about, the uterus and where inside you a baby is going to grow, and about the monthly cycle, and all these things inside your body. But they show you a film about it that's a cartoon drawing, really. They're not going to be too graphic. So Margie, when she was 11, Margie saw the same cartoon that they show to all 11-year-old girls in the United States. And it has drawings inside a woman's body with the ovaries and the fallopian tubes coming down to the uterus. And it shows each month how the uterus, the lining builds up with all sorts of nutrients in anticipation if an egg is going to be there and be fertilized. And one version shows you what happens if it's fertilized and the baby starts growing. But the other scenario in the film shows you that if it's not fertilized that month, that the menstrual period happens. This is all to warn us that we're about to start getting our menstrual periods is half of the point, and then that we could get pregnant if we are not careful is the other half of it. So she watched this cartoon at 11, and then she recalls seeing it, and when they said the thing about how the uterus prepares for a pregnancy each month, and then if there's not a pregnancy, it sloughs off all this tissue and blood, she remembers thinking, even as her 11-year-old self, like, that's just wasteful, that's impractical, that's too much work each month for that. I don't remember thinking that as an 11-year-old, but I do remember the film. Anyway, so flash forward to she's 30 years old. She's become a biologist. She has all the skills to look into these sorts of issues, but she hasn't thought about menstruation or fertility or any of those things in 20 years. And she's a biologist who's doing research on allergy, actually, what the various mediating responses in allergy are. However, one night she had a dream. I'll just read the dream. I saw cartoon images of a woman's body, like the ones in the school film. The ovaries were pale yellow. The uterus was deep red. There were black triangles in the endometrium. Blood was coming out. Here we go. Blood was coming out, taking the triangles with it. Then my cat meowed, wanting out. He was quite the nocturnal hunter. I woke up into this half-awake state and thought, the black things are pathenogens, that's why. Pathenogens meaning bacteria, viruses, things that cause local illness. So basically, her dream-inspired theory posits that harmful bacteria enter the womb and the fallopian tubes, essentially hitchhiking on sperm, and that menstruation eliminates the intruders in two ways. The slowed-off uterine lining physically carries the microbes off, and the blood itself is rich with immune cells, which engulf the pathenogens. And this is when it was published, a drawing, still kind of like the 11-year-old cartoon version. So her theory, and she did some research to back this up, showing that indeed sperm are often have bacteria hitchhiking in on them, and that the menstrual process is rich with macrophages, which are getting out of this, and that it has a cleaning and disease prevention function, which was not being described in the films to 11-year-olds, or really known to medicine until that time. So Margie Prophet's dream earned her a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, and this theory of menstruation has become pretty much the standardly accepted one in biology. And Margie herself said that at the time that she dreamed it, she'd only heard of one such example of a scientist making a major breakthrough in a dream, which is probably at least in the United States, the all-time most famous example, which is Kekulé, when he was working on the structure of benzene. All known molecules at that time were some kind of straight line with side chains off at a right angle. And so it was known what the atoms making up the benzene molecule were, but this was before we had electron microscopes that could just directly look at it and see the structure. So he was trying to come up with a structure which made sense knowing what the atoms were, but he was trying to arrange them in straight lines with the side chain, and nothing was making sense of it. Until then he had a dream in which he says, first of all, that this is an artist's rendition of it, but it's actually not exactly like the dream, because in the dream he said that he fell asleep and the atoms were dancing in front of his eyes, and then he says that some of the atoms formed into snakes. So then when he's talking about snakes, they are snakes made of atoms. So So he's watching the snakes dance around in front of his eyes, and then one of the snakes reached around and took its tail in its mouth, and he woke up with a start, realizing that the structure benzene was a closed ring rather than a straight line with side chains, and awakened and wrote that off. But what he saw was not as snaky as the thing at the top, but the way he describes it verbally seems to have always been seeing it as composed of atoms. And that example has two of the key elements that I'll point out several more times here, which are dreams can solve any kind of problem that somebody has been thinking on awake. But the two cases in which they're especially likely to do something that the waking mind hasn't is if the problem lends itself to being visualized. We see things in a more clear, hallucinatory, we can see something as if it exists that doesn't exist yet in our dreams much more vividly than most people can just imagine something by closing their eyes and picturing it. That's number one. If something needs to be really visualized, dreams do that better. And secondly, if the reason that you haven't solved the problem is because the answer lies, we have a phrase in the US, thinking outside the box. I don't know if that's used here, but if the conventional wisdom is wrong, if the way that all the experts would say that you should approach this problem turns out not to be the case, the issue that all known molecules in the very early days of chemistry were straight lines and side chains, had Kekulé trying to construct the figure with a straight line and side chains, and that just turned out to be wrong in this case. That for exactly the same reason that lots of dreams seem more nonsensical, if the conventional wisdom is wrong, they're likelier to be taking a loose approach. So they may end up with more wrong answers, but if the right answer lies outside conventional wisdom, they're likelier to hit it. So this Kekulé example really illustrates both of those things very much. Visualization and get away from whatever the conventional wisdom dictates. Another early example that a little bit less known about is not my next slide. Let's see. Okay, we just seem not to have a slide for that. Sorry. When Mendeleev was designing the periodic table of the elements, unfortunately, no one knows how far he'd gotten with it. His written diaries say that he had been arranging tables based on the various attributes of different elements to come up with something like the periodic table, and that he wasn't satisfied with any of his drafts of this. And that then one night he dreamed that the table formed in front of him and that it had the elements arranged in some different ways than he had thought about. That it was like the tables he'd been designing, except some elements came into different places, and he realized that was a better organization. So he does say that he awakened and did the periodic table exactly as he'd seen it in the dream. But in that case, the missing element is we don't know how much of the order of the periodic table was already done and which things were different in the earlier drafts before the dream version. But also, just a few years after Kekulé's chemistry breakthrough, Harvard's Professor Louis Agassiz was extracting a fossil fish, which was a completely unknown species. And again, this is in the days before we had lots of modern technology. So to extract a fossil fish, one had to pretty much guess what its structure was as one was chipping away the rock. These days, one can just take certain spectron microscopes and look through and see what's fish structure versus what's the overlying rock structure. But in those days, it was all guesswork. So it was an unknown specimen, and he didn't want to ruin it, so he was being very slow and hesitant in extracting it. And so at some point in trying to work on it, Agassiz had a dream, and in the dream he saw the fish just swimming in front of him, and it looked very different than the fish that he'd been imagining, but he thought, yes, that's right, that's what the fossil is. And he thought he knew how to extract it. And this is a warning for doing this yourself. He went back to sleep, and in the morning when he woke up, all he could remember was that he'd seen the fish, he'd been sure it was the shape the fish was, but he couldn't remember the details of what the fish looked like during the night. And there are some stories like that where that's in the story. However, he had the same dream the next night. He fell asleep and he saw this fish hovering in front of him and thought, that's my fossil fish in the flesh, that's what it's supposed to look like. Now I know its structure, again in the middle of the night, and again did not recall it by morning. So third try, he put a pad and pen by his bed for the third night, and fortunately the dream obliged, and he dreamed the third night that the fish was floating in front of him, and he knew what its structure should be. And this time he woke up and he sketched it immediately and in detail, and that morning he went to the lab and extracted the fossil rather perfectly from the rock based on the image that he'd seen in the dream. And there's a very similar story that goes with Otto Loewy winning the 1936 Nobel Prize in Medicine, which he had for a long time suspected that the nature of nerve conduction was at least partially chemical, but he hadn't been able to think up an experiment that would prove this. And so one night he had a dream that he was in his lab and he was doing an experiment, and it proved it. However, the first time he had this dream, by morning he just remembered that he'd done this elaborate, specific experiment that proved it, and he couldn't recall what it was. And so, again, the next night he had a pad and pen by his bed, and he had the dream again. And he'd meant to write it down, but he didn't even simply write it down. When the dream occurred the second time, he woke up with a clear memory of it, and he just headed down to his laboratory and performed this experiment, which essentially consisted of taking one frog, electrically stimulating its heart so that it speeded up faster and faster, then suctioning the fluid from around that heart and spraying that onto the heart of another frog, and that heart speeded up immediately, proving that there was something, had to be something biochemical in the fluid around the heart that was mediating the electrical conduction. But all of those anecdotes illustrate how fragile the memory for dreams is, even for very important dreams like those, that someone could dream that breakthrough and forget it. And presumably sometimes people dream breakthroughs and forget them forever, but sometimes the dreams come back like that. Now, math is something that doesn't show up in most people's dreams, but mathematicians nevertheless tend to have a lot of mathematical content in their dreams. And one of your major mathematicians, another name which I'm bound to fumble here, well, I won't even do the first name, Ramanujan. Your Anyway, Ramanujan, whose name everyone in the room at me can pronounce, actually said that he owed all his mathematical discoveries to dreams. Several biographies of him quote secondarily some of the Hardy and other mathematicians in England that he was talking to about this, where apparently repeatedly he told people that he dreamed all of his major proofs, And on at least some occasions, he said that the proofs were brought to him in dreams by the Hindu goddess Namagiri. But different people seemed to interpret that differently as to whether he actually perceived the goddess in the dream or whether it was just his belief that if dreams were given to you, they were coming from your patron goddess. The two examples that, quoted examples that exist that he ever told someone was that Namagiri would write the equations on his tongue, and he could see the equations on his own tongue sometimes. And the other was that he described a particular proof that he was seeing a hand writing across a screen that was made red by flowing blood, and the writing was in gold across the flowing blood. So even though it's a little bit unclear whether Namagiri herself was in the dream or was just being attributed as the giver of the dream, it does seem very clear that he was actually seeing the proof being written out, that it wasn't, as some other examples I'll get to are more conceptual, that it seemed to be a very visual, very specific, in its final form, kind of writing out of the proof that he experienced. But unfortunately, just like with the Mendeleev example, there's not a lot of detail. For some of these people, lots of the dreams are recorded. And if anyone here should know of things that are in Indian language only about Ramanujan, I'd love to hear, because his English language biographers, at least, have not found any more than that about the details of his dreaming. Back to Harvard, where a lot of my examples come from. Barry Mazur is probably the main star, certainly one of the stars of our mathematics department. And there's a technique of his which is sort of nicknamed Mazur's swindle, which involves solving three-dimensional topology problems with very odd-shaped three-dimensional objects by completing that object with an object that would turn it into a sphere, make up the rest of the sphere, when combined with that object, and leaving those spheres on for lots of calculations, and then only at the end of everything taking away the sort of other parts of the sphere. Makes it much easier to deal with some of these strange shapes in calculations and proofs. So he had actually already come up with that technique, which is called Mazur's swindle, for working on certain kinds of topology problems. But what he describes dreaming is soon after having invented that technique and applied it to the kinds of things that he'd been struggling with then, that he had a dream where he dropped off to sleep and he saw these odd shapes being joined into spheres, happening somewhat the way he intentionally visualized it when he was working on a problem, only they were just doing odd things that he wasn't directing, and he didn't at first know what they were doing. So he was just watching with curiosity what all of these add-on and make sphere permutations, where they were going, and realized that they were solving something called Schoenfeld's theorem, which is a famous problem in topology, which he'd certainly heard of, but was not one that he was consciously working on at the time. But he woke up realizing that his swindle technique with the spheres was also a very good way of solving and proving Schoenfeld's theorem. So the dream did that part of it, just took his already developed technique and saw this other application for it. William Lamberton at the University of Pennsylvania says that on more than one occasion he's dreamed a proof. And again, he seems to see it fully formed on a blackboard, and that only in these dreams, which have only happened a handful of times, as he wakes up, he perceives the blackboard still lingering, hanging in the air over his bed, so that even once his eyes are open and he's essentially out of the dream, he can still see the dream's solution, which he believes helps him get it written down before it fades from memory. And back to Harvard, Stephen Bailey, who actually was a physics doctoral student when he had this dream, has since graduated, is well trained in computer science, but is himself mainly a physicist. And a computer science friend had described a particular problem that other person was working on, which involved needing to manipulate lots of huge matrices into storage and out of storage to deal with enormous data sets and how to manage data. And he'd been talking about this to Steve Bailey in a lot of detail, but Steve had no conscious intent of working on this. He was doing his own physics work. But that night he went to sleep, and he said that he saw all of these matrices and data sets moving around in front of him and realized that they were doing exactly what they needed to efficiently disappear when they weren't in use and reappear when they were needed, and that he was essentially watching a program that solved his friend's dilemma. So he woke up and wrote it down and gave it to the other person, and it worked with no intent of doing that at all. And although that was the most fully formed program he'd ever written that way, he said that often when he was working on his own programming for physics, that smaller parts of that came to him. In fact, when I first started talking to him about this, he said, "I often dream in C++. And as a non-computer person, I can't imagine dreaming in computer language, but I often dream in C++. However, some other computer scientists get help from dreams without it being as literally in the language. There's a Canadian programmer named Bill Markowick, who says that he's had some breakthrough dreams about his computing, but that it's always just a key concept to what he needs to do, that the dream seems to show him some way of approaching it in a much more abstract way. And he says it's almost like the dream's kind of saying, I've done the important part, you slob, you have to go work out all the detailed calculations and write it into code. So he never sees the specific code there. Another computer scientist who's the only one who in his problem-solving dreams is lucid, knows he's dreaming while he's dreaming, and that's something that I'm going to talk about a lot more in my workshop this afternoon. It doesn't seem at all necessary to problem-solving dreams, but when it happens, it has interesting interactions with them. But this computer scientist, all of his problem-solving dreams are lucid, and when he's stuck on a programming problem, he says, at night I will dream that I'm sitting in a parlor, an old-fashioned one like Sherlock Holmes might use. I'm sitting with Einstein, white bushy hair in the flesh. He and I are good friends. We talk about the program, start to do some flowcharts on a blackboard. Once we've come up with a good one, we laugh. I look at myself and say, I want to remember that flowchart when I wake up. I concentrate very hard on the blackboard, and then I wake up. I get out my pencil and notepad and start writing as fast as I can. But he makes it clear it's a flowchart of concepts, not literally the language that he's going to write it into. So different computer scientists seem to get different kinds of modality. The same way some of the musicians hear the music, some see it as notes or see it in this synesthetic, some other sort of way yet. Another example from more the physics engineering realm is my colleague Paul Horowitz at Harvard works on designing the controls of telescopes. His real passion was always SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and actually the main program called SETI has closed down within the last year, but the ways of trying to look via giant telescopes for signs of intelligent life definitely continues. So Paul Horowitz builds telescopes for very conventional sorts of radio telescope use, but then negotiates bits of time to be searching for extraterrestrial. And most of his designs are radio telescopes because radio signals can travel much greater distance than light. However, at the time that I interviewed him, around 1990 first, laser technology had been developing so much that they had decided that it was time for the world's first laser optics telescope, because laser beams, as opposed to any other form of light, can travel further. So Paul said that because there was no laser telescope in existence, there were just literally dozens of questions about how to construct this. He said that instead of being one big problem, it would be how to arrange a group of lenses in one part of the telescope, and then how to design the little computer chip that was going to control connecting them to something else, and then how to arrange some other part of the optics. And that just about every 2 weeks he would get stuck on some piece of the design, and that for the laser telescope the questions were much bigger than they had been for radio telescopes, because nothing like this had been done. And so he says that whenever he's stuck on a problem, much more consistently than many people get help, he says that he always has a dream that solves the problem. He says they're different from his other dreams. They always occur in the middle of the night. They're much more logical. And basically, they always occur in the format that he is looking over the shoulder of a man who's doing whatever Paul needs to be doing. And a voice is narrating the dilemma as to what the advantages of placing the optics in this or that way, and what the drawback will be to this or that approach, or why you might want to wire the chip this way, but that would make it a little larger than ideal. Just all the pros and cons that he's been thinking about. The voice narrates, and he sees over the shoulder, he sees this man playing either with the lenses, if it's a lens problem, or with the computer chip, if it's a computer chip. And then the voice shifts to saying the best solution would be, and spells out how to do it. And at the same time, the man begins to then assemble the optics or the chip in exactly that way. And just clear, specific instructions. And so thinking of the sort of Einstein example or the John Nash example, I said, well, what does your guy look like? Or what's the voice sound like? Wondering if it was going to be one of these wise man things. And Paul said, well, he'd never really thought about it before, but now that he did, that even though he's looking over this guy's shoulder, the guy looks just about like himself. And even though he's never identified it as his own voice, the voice sounds pretty much like his own. So he's not one of those people that projects it off onto the wisest man he can. It seems to be just a kind of separated off image of himself. And another, and this is one of Paul's, this is actually one of his radio telescopes, not the laser one. Another laser-linked example comes from Alan Huang, who is head of AT&T Bell Laboratory Optical Computing Research Department. And when he was working on creating the first optical laser circuits ever, as opposed to electrical ones, he was stuck on some of the design, again, because this had never been done before. And he said in retrospect he was using models that came much more from conventional electric computing than he needed to. And so he began to have this dream repeatedly where two opposing armies of sorcerers' apprentices were carrying buckets which he knew had data in them. The two armies of apprentices with their buckets of data would approach each other, and they would stop just short of colliding, and he would wake up. And he didn't know what to make of that dream, and it happened over and over while he was working ineffectively at the laser telescope. And then one night he had the same dream, and the armies of apprentices with their buckets with data approached each other, and they just passed through each other. And he realized that if you're made of light, you can pass through each other, and electrical circuits can't intersect or they short each other out, but laser circuits can pass through each other, and that most of the construction of a laser computer circuit doesn't have to obey. And he went back and began to design things much more radically differently than the electrical circuits, and the Bell Labs laser computers were born from that. A really ancient example was in the 15th century. The Korean and Japanese navies used to fight offshore, and in those days, for some reason, more of the fighting was done on boats. The ships would go out to the middle of the ocean, but they would shoot flaming daggers at each other, sink ships, and a lot of the who won or not was fought in the naval battles. And in the 1500s, Korea was losing one of these naval interactions rather badly, and the commander of their navy had a dream in which he saw this creature that was kind of half giant turtle dragon. It seemed to be alive. It had this head like a dragon or a turtle, and it had a shell like a turtle, only made of metal, but it was also a boat. He knew there were men inside it, and the turtle shell was repelling the arrows of the enemy boats. And also, it was sort of flat and could circle around on its stomach in any direction, whereas most boats could just go straight through water the way they were constructed. And so it was circling around and able to shoot at and sink other boats, and none of their arrows could do anything to it, and it could maneuver better. And so this giant turtle boat thing was winning the interactions. And so he woke up and he realized that a metal covering on a wooden boat would make it impermeable to these flaming arrows, and that for the kind of up-close maneuvering that these ships were doing in these days, that a flat round bottom that you could turn on rather than a deep rudder going through the water made sense. So he commanded his navy to build a bunch of these turtle ships, and this is actually a modern recreation of one, but it, at least in that particular point in time, it reversed the outcome of the Japanese-Korean interaction, and was essentially the world's first armored battleship, as he saw it in a dream. Gunshot was also, modern gunshot was invented in a dream. Until 1782, gunshot was made by laboriously hammering out lead until you have little balls of lead from big pieces of lead. And one of the people doing this, William Watt, found that he started having this recurring dream that the sky was raining molten lead down, and it would land in puddles and cool. And at first he just thought that was a strange dream connected to hammering lead all day. And then finally, about the fourth time he had it, he realized that if you drop molten lead into water, it condenses as a little round pellet without your having to hammer at it. You just heat it, break it up into drops, and it condenses and forms itself, which is an infinitely easier way to make gunshot. The sewing machine was seen by its inventor in a dream. Elias Howe had figured out all the rest of what was going to make the sewing machine run and all, but not how to hold the needle. If you think of the kind of needle that you just hand sew with a point at one end and a hole at the other, there's no way to grip it and let it pass through fabric, and yet that's what he was trying to do. How was his machine going to grip a regular sewing needle? And he had a dream that he was in a jungle and he was surrounded by savages who threatened him with spears and told him that if he didn't finish his sewing machine immediately, they would kill him. And he was panicking, and then he saw that all the spears had a hole in the pointed front end of the spear, and he woke up both in terror, but realizing that for a sewing machine, you put the hole at the end with the point, so you can hold it somewhere else, which is now so obvious after decades and decades of seeing sewing machines, but was not. Again, it's that think outside the box, ignore conventional wisdom. Don't put the hole in the place that you think it needs to be. So how do dreams do all this? Since the 1950s, as I imagine most of you know, researchers have known that about every 90 minutes we're in rapid eye movement or REM sleep, which is when dreams seem to occur. The brain becomes pretty much as active as it is when we're awake, but somewhat differentially so. Parts of the cortex that are associated with visual imagery are even more active than awake. Motor areas are about as active as awake, even though the areas that would connect them to actual muscles are turned off. And some deep areas of the brain that have to do with emotion are often even more activated than awake. On the other hand, our language areas are not turned off, but they're damped down a little bit. And the biggest difference in the damp down direction is what's known as the prefrontal cortex, which is behind your forehead there, which seems to have to do with sort of fine aspects of judgment and reasoning, and especially censorship. Both censorship in the Freudian sense of sex and aggression, like, no, that's not proper, you can't do that, that's way turned off in dreaming, but also censorship in the no, that's not logical, that's not the, doesn't make any sense, that's not the way to do it. That's way lowered. And that really seems to match the dream content. More visual stuff, lots of motor movement, even though we're not acting it out, fair bit of emotionality, and then certainly some language, but less language on average, and way less of this censoring things, either for social reasons or for sort of conventional wisdom, logic reasons. So I think that basically dreaming is just thinking in a different biochemical state. Our biochemicals are different parts of our brain are more or less active, but we're still thinking about all of the same thoughts and concerns. And since almost the 1950s, we've known that if you do a learning task and then either let somebody sleep or just let them be awake but quiet a similar period and retest it, that they do better after the sleep. But more recently, they found that REM sleep, the sleep associated with dreaming, seems even more important to memory consolidation. And then also there's some research where if you're trying to teach people a rather abstract task, where they give people little puzzles to solve, and each one can be individually solved, but if you realize some overarching something they have in common, it helps you get faster and faster with each one if you realize that big principle, and if not, you just keep solving each one more slowly, one by one. If you give people that sort of task and you let them get some REM sleep, they're way likelier to get the big overarching thing that speeds up the process, the what's in common across all these, than either other stages of sleep or not sleeping. And they don't usually collect the dreams, but even when they do, you don't always see it in the dream content, but some of that just seems to say that something about dreaming sleep is advantageous. But then also recently there have been some studies documenting just what essentially these anecdotes that I've been talking about do of dream-solving problems. In the late 70s, William Dement gave 500 students at Stanford brain teasers to solve. And he just had them doing this for 3 nights. At bedtime, they were supposed to look at this brain teaser, tell themselves what they wanted to dream about it, and then write down all of their dreams. And in that study, 87 people dreamed about the brain teaser they were working on, and 7 out of 500 had a dream that solved it. And so for my own research, I actually think brain teasers are interesting in relation to dreams because they do have an aha, breakthrough, think outside the box. But I think that some of them can be very difficult as part of it, but also some of them just aren't that relevant. There's no reason you have to solve a brain teaser if somebody gives it to you. So for my own research, I took the alternate paradigm of having students select a problem they were already working on. Just had to be an objective one where they could identify a correct solution. And then I had them, now there's my mental F slide when I don't need it. Okay. And I had them look over the problem at bedtime, visualize the problem in their mind, tell themselves they wanted to dream about it, and then write down dreams in the morning. And I looked at this 2 different ways. These are the subject's own ratings, and it's really the bottom to the 49% and 34%. When they rated them, approximately half had had a dream on the topic in the course of 1 week of doing this, and then 34 approximately. Whoops, I didn't move that yet. These numbers. 49, or essentially half, dreamed on their topic, and is rated by the dreamers themselves about 34% or 1/3 had a solution. However, when I had objective judges who just knew what the problem was, rating, does this problem appear in the dream, does a solution to it appear in the dream, it was very similar for, is it on the topic, 51%, but it was 25%, more like a quarter, were judged to have a solution. So there were a few that were more metaphoric. The students felt like it led them toward the correct solution, but the judges, looking just at the dream, could not see a solution there. But still, quite dramatic results, much stronger than in DeMint's study, and actually more. I'm collecting an ongoing one from working adults, and I'm getting quite a few of them dreaming on their problem and some of them dreaming a solution, but it's lower than these numbers, and I think it's partly because college students have better dream recall than older adults, and also because they really were picking pretty easy problems like homework problems that they hadn't solved awake yet but were going to, and that in almost all the other studies it becomes more difficult. So I actually think this 50% dreaming about whatever they're targeting in the course of the week is a much more sort of generalizable result. And then the difficulty of the problem is definitely going to interact with the what percentage dream and answer that quickly. But it's certainly some people in every way the study can be parsed. So let's see, I want to make sure I get to this sort of how-to part of it, so I'm going to skip any other examples now. When I do my workshop this afternoon at 3:30, I'm going to talk a lot more about the how-to aspects, but for people who don't come to that, I wanted to make sure that I went over that just a little bit. So these are the instructions that I gave the people in the study. The first 6 actually were all that the people in the study had, which was I coached them a little bit on how to select a problem that was likely to respond well to the dream idea. And then number 1 is write it down as a brief phrase or sentence and have that by your bed. Review the problem for a few minutes just before going to bed. And once in bed, visualize the problem. If there's any way that the question or issue you're working on lends itself to some sort of visual image, dreams are so visual that images you've been visualizing are even likelier to make it into the dream content than just the phrase. Then tell yourself you want to dream about the problem just as you're drifting off to sleep. This is actually a really good time for any self-suggestion. That sort of getting sleepy, half-awake stage is a stage where hypnotherapists use that a lot as a time to reinforce sort of self-hypnotic suggestions about how you want to smoke less or remember things better or eat healthier or anything. It's a time when your mind is especially suggestible, but it's especially good for this purpose because it's also the time that is the closest to the dream occurring as well as a time you're suggestible. So tell yourself, I want to dream about X. And then equally important is what you do in the morning. Keep a pad and pen by the bed, perhaps a flashlight or pen if you sleep in a room with someone else that you don't want to disturb and you may be waking up in the middle of the night from some of these dreams. You might want some kind of little pen light to be able to write. And upon awakening, just lie quietly. Obviously, if you clearly recall a dream, start writing it down. Great. But if you think that you don't remember a dream at first, that's the time when it's the likeliest to come back. If you don't jump up and turn your attention to something else, but you just stay with, is there mood you woke up in, or are you thinking about one person or concept? Sometimes if you just very quietly stay with whatever is lingering from your sleep state, a whole dream will come flooding back quickly. Whereas if you jump up and attend to anything else, it's likely to be gone for good. One of my colleagues at the University of Texas did a study on dream recall where he had two conditions where he either asked people to wake up in the morning and write down all the dreams that they remembered, or to wake up in the morning, call the time of day service, write down the exact time of day, and then write down all the dreams they recalled. And the second group recalled about half as much dream content. The dreams they recalled were shorter, and entire dreams seemed to be disappearing. Just by calling this number and noting the time of day was enough to, because the dream content is there in short-term memory when we wake up, but it needs to be thought about immediately to get transferred into long-term, and writing it down is the very best way to do that. And then these were not in my research, but these are things that I use with clients a lot. If you want to be a little bit more elaborate, you can visualize yourself waking up with the inspiring dream and writing it down. Or especially for people who don't have really strong internal visual imagery, if you arrange some objects connected to the problem on your night table or the wall across from the bed, make a poster of them if they lend themselves to that, so that you have some external visual aid, especially if your internal imagery is not particularly vivid, because our dreaming mind does respond so much to images that constructing some image display to remind it that you want to be dreaming about this is even more effective than the phrase, but always using the phrase. So, like I say, in the workshop I'm doing later, I'll go through a lot more detail and examples about how you can pick out problems that you want to work on and use these incubation techniques. But in case there's some people, this is my book that describes this. It has a lot more detail on this. But the slide I'm trying to get to here is if anyone already has had some really interesting problem-solving dreams, I'm always interested to hear about that. So that's my email address up there. The dot means nothing. My computer program just insists on putting it in there, but that's my HMS is for Harvard Med School at Harvard EDU, sort of standard. So if anybody already has some interesting dream examples and would like to dialogue about this by email, certainly email me about that. But secondly, if you try the incubation tonight or while you're here, whether just from hearing it here or after you've done the workshop. I'd love to hear results of that, actually, even if they don't solve things, just did you have any dreams? Because often when you're sleeping in a sort of crazy new place like this, you might not the very first night, and then once you're home, it will work better. Anyway, so I want to take just a few questions. I think there's supposed to be a mic that will go down to the audience, and then we're close to end of time, so we should stop soon and pick up more of the sort of individual stuff at the workshop. But who's got isn't there a mic for the...
Throughout your lecture, I just realized one thing, that a lot of people were giving a lot of thought about whatever they were doing. So the thought that came into my mind was, is it lucid dreaming a method of giving an output to the analysis by subconscious mind?
Well, lucid dreaming usually means the knowing you're dreaming while you're dreaming. And I think that is certainly the prefrontal area that I was talking about being usually very turned off in dreams seems to wake up a little bit more in a lucid dream. So some of our reflecting on what we're on goes on a little bit more in lucid dreaming. But I think just for some of these problem-solving dreams, I think that that they are just tuning in more to unconscious processes, as you say. I mean, there's lots of evidence that lots of our thought does not make it into our chain of consciousness. That when you give people subliminal perceptions where you see or hear something very quickly, people won't be able to consciously say what was in that slide, and yet they can guess at it, or they'll laugh when it was something funny, even though they don't know why they're laughing. So lots of our processing is going on outside of consciousness. And I think that dreams have this ability to access some of what's usually not conscious, partly because of which areas are turned on, and partly because we don't have to pay attention to all the sensory input that is bombarding us the rest of the time. Something that I didn't go into in this talk, but write about in the books on problem solving, is that a lot of people learn that they're ill in the course of a dream, and although some people interpret this as sort of paranormal, telepathic information, it's usually something that's already present in the body, and it seems like just some sensation that we're not going to notice awake when we're busy having to process visual input and all can sometimes get our attention in a dream. I think that's what's happening with thinking of, oh, maybe the chemical structure doesn't have to be a straight line, that just lots of parts of ourselves thinking. So yes, I do think it's accessing the unconscious, but then I think lucid dreams are accessing some of that, reflecting on the nature of reality that we actually do more of awake, as well as still having the unconscious there. Yeah, other questions?
People, please stop leaving. Sit down, please. Yeah.
What about the role of intuition in problem solving? Intuition. When you compare dreams with intuitions, people talk about, some scientists talk about they had an intuition about some problem and they could solve it.
Illusion?
Intuition.
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the main word, sorry. Illusion?
Intuition. INTUTION.
Dreams they're very visual mode, number one, and at least sometimes in other forms of intuition, there are no words, there are no images, it's sort of pure concept. People often describe intuitive flashes coming to them. So I think that again, almost any of the things, I do think that intuition is that kind of unconscious part of your mind that's busy working on things, kind of throwing another kind of solution forward that your consciousness hasn't been focused on. But I think that there may be certain times where just breaking through from one part of our waking self to another is more useful, and that does seem to be often those like there's no particular sensory or verbal content to it. And then, like I say, the dreams seem especially good with ones where imagery is helping, or, oh, let's do it this other way. So I certainly think that intuition and dream creativity are related, but maybe what they most excel at is different. In the intuition, it's the get away from words or images, and for dreams, it's the images especially. Yes.
When people with the history of sleepwalking, we train to record dreams in real time.
Sleepwalking. Actually, when they bring sleepwalkers into the laboratory, most of them are not walking in REM sleep. Most of them are walking in other stages of sleep. And most people are paralyzed during REM sleep and yet can move but just don't have as much content that makes them want to. So garden variety sleepwalking and sleep talking seem to happen in other stages of sleep where the brain is not nearly as active. And if you wake a sleepwalker up, they often either they have no content to what they think they've been doing, or it's some very simple, I was trying to get to, this pasture, kind of not an elaborate dream thing. However, a few people do have a failure of the paralysis during REM sleep, which is to keep us from moving around because there's so much motor commands. And those people actually tend to be much more vigorous. They move around, they flail around, they're likely to hurt themselves, they're likely to hurt someone else because there's so much more activity going on in our dreams. And likewise, it's not as potentially dangerous for sleep talking, but for sleep talking, most people talking in their sleep are not dreaming, but some people are in REM sleep, and there's a real difference in what people say. In the deeper stages of sleep, people may just say one word, or if they say a phrase, it's likely to be a phrase that they repeat over and over, like somebody who's just become a cashier as a job in the last few weeks may be mumbling, "Thank you very much, please come again. Thank you very much, please come again." That's a real example from one sleep lab study. Whereas people who are sleep talking out of REM or dreaming sleep have much more varied, they'll have long, complex sentences, they'll laugh, they'll tell jokes, sometimes they do long monologues, but other times they do dialogues. You either hear them saying one side of a conversation and then waiting an appropriate amount of time as if someone else was speaking and then speaking, or occasionally they seem to be speaking for both characters in a conversation. And if you wake them up, they will recall a dream that is related to the conversation, whereas when you wake people up from most other sleep talking, they don't remember it at all, or it's something like just being in a certain place or something simple. So a minority of sleepwalking and sleep talking map onto dreams, but they're more interesting when they do.
So amongst this minority, let's look at lucid dreamers. The people who actually dream lucidly and they know that they're dreaming. Over time, can they train themselves to type while dreaming?
We are supposed to be paralyzed during REM sleep. It seems to be a safety mechanism so that we won't act out. Most of the people who move around a lot in REM sleep have problems because they end up injuring themselves. Theoretically, if you could move and move only in your lucid dreams, that might be nice, but any known neurological mechanism that would interfere with the paralysis that is supposed to be there would be interfering with the paralysis during other dreams, and those people really do run into walls and bash at things and hurt themselves much more than other sleep sleepwalking, so it's dangerous to play with anything that interferes with that inhibition. The experiments that have been done with asking lucid dreamers to do any movements rely on the things that aren't paralyzed, like it's called rapid eye movement sleep, because our eyes move around all the time because they are the only thing for most people that are not paralyzed. So they have found that you can teach people Morse code where the dashes are horizontal movements and the dots are represented by vertical movements, and get people to spell things out in Morse code while they're lucid dreaming with just their eyes, because the eyes are never paralyzed anyway, so it's kind of a slow, laborious way to speak from REM sleep, but you can get communications out of a lucid dream that way. And then many fewer people will show twitching, and I don't know if you've ever watched someone sleep. If you're watching someone in dreaming sleep, you'll definitely see the rapid eye movements. That's a really sort of low-tech, non-lab way to know someone's dreaming. But some people show these little twitches in the fingertips at the same time, and other people don't. That's the only other breach of the paralysis for most people. And so there have been a few studies in England where they found some of the people who twitched their fingers the most during REM sleep and brought them in and tried to train them to just motion with one finger or something. But if your hands were unparalyzed enough to type, that would represent a kind of dangerous lack of the inhibition of not moving, which is clearly there to keep us from killing ourselves when we're in dreaming sleep and not aware of how we're moving. I mean, it's an interesting idea, but it's potentially dangerous to try. There may be some things that would temporarily inhibit the paralysis just for 1 night that are carefully supervised, but that's why it hasn't been done, at least so far. Other?
Hello, ma'am. Recently there was a project in Hollywood named Inception. So would you like to comment on the practical aspect of that project?
Well, there are certain things in Inception that are very possible, like lucid dreaming, like training yourself to be aware that you're dreaming while you're dreaming is not as easy for everyone as they make it look in the movie, but it's certainly something that you can focus on and train yourself to do more of. That's actually something I'm going to talk a lot more about in the workshop this afternoon. So that part of it is pretty realistic. As is, I think some of the scenes early in it. How many people have seen Inception? I think that the scenes early in the movie are really interested in dreams and lucid dreams and being fairly accurate to it, like that scene when the very first time the architect becomes lucid in the cafe, and Leonardo DiCaprio's character starts asking her, "How did we get here? You know, you don't remember how we got to the cafe?" That sort of thing is very true to the dream state. That occasionally we have either real memories for everything we did the day before, or occasionally we have a faux memory for how we got to everything that's in the dream environment. But most of the time, we're in just kind of current time and space without nearly the sense of memory that we usually have. And as soon as you start reflecting on it, that's missing. And then, although all that running around, bending, the street up to the sky that she does is it's depicted as a little bit easier than it necessarily is once you're lucid. It's definitely the kind of thing that people start playing with. Wow, it's a dream, I can do anything to physical reality I want, seems to be a very common thing to think and start trying. Although for many people it's somewhat harder than that. It's sort of just willing something to bend or change a little bit can sort of be a slow process for some people. And also, I did a research project on lucid dreams called Just How Lucid Are Lucid Dreams, where I looked at some of the things that I called corollaries of lucidity, like if you know it's a dream, you should know that the people in it are not the real waking life people, they are dream characters. If you know it's a dream, you should know that you don't have to obey the laws of physics. If you know it's a dream, you should know that objects that you take here are not coming back into the real world with you, etc. So I took several of these corollaries and I looked at dreams that were clearly lucid, where the person at some point realizes I'm dreaming, and looked at how many of these other things were accurate versus faulty. And it was about 50-50 for each corollary. About half the time the person knew they were dreaming for any given logical outcome. About half the time they would still have that wrong. I mean, they would know they were dreaming, and yet they would still be looking for the key to unlock the door, to get out of the door, and it would not be crossing their mind that they could just walk through the door. Or they would realize they were dreaming and they would start telling another character, okay, wow, this is a dream. So as soon as we wake up, I'm going to call you and we're going to compare notes on everything that we dreamed to prove that this was a lucid dream. Or they would be writing down notes in the dream on dream paper so they wouldn't forget the early part of the dream, and they'd have their dream account when they woke up. Or they'd be grabbing other objects that were going to prove they were in the dream world. So only about half the time per corollary were all the logical, oh, okay, I'm dreaming, this means you're a dream character, and they might start trying to convince the person they were a dream character, which indeed they are, but which they don't always acknowledge in your dreams. So you get all kinds of combinations of that. But anyway, in Inception, I thought that the way that they depicted how confusing it is in dreams not to be able to remember something, how delightful playing with the physical environment is, that a lot of the things early on were very true to the quality of dreams. But then later, in the second half of Inception, it seemed like they were using the dreams mostly to support the plot of the sort of heist, theft, car chase sort of plot. Like in many heist movies where somebody's stealing something, the plot revolves around sort of a ticking clock. We have to get into the bank vault in this amount of time before the security guard comes around, or before the camera's going to this, or there's this set amount of time we have to perform these procedures, is a lot of the suspense in a heist plot. And I thought in one way it was just brilliant that they had a way of having 4 ticking clocks going by saying, oh, well, at each dream level, time happens, at a speed of 10 relative to first to waking life and then to the levels above it. And so that meant that they could have, 4 different sets of weird things they had to carry out before 4 different clocks were going to have, something that cut off the plot. Very good for heist plot, but I thought that just got away from having anything to do with dreams. The idea that, best we can tell, dream time maps on pretty much one-to-one with waking time. It can vary in either direction, but there's been studies where they watch how long someone's in REM, wake them up after they've been in REM for 5 minutes, ask them to describe a dream, and then to describe about how long it feels like it's taken. And it maps pretty much on, about 5 minutes worth of dream usually seems to have taken 5 minutes to occur. There's certainly exceptions. There are people that feel like they just dreamed 3 years of their life in what still has to be, 30 minutes or less total dream time, or occasionally distortions the other way. But on average, dream time, real time seems to map pretty well. So a lot of, and there is no known electrical or chemical way to go into someone else's dreams, much as we dream researchers would love for there to be. The closest thing to being able to influence someone else's dream is some of the experiments where you whisper quietly to a sleeper. You'll wake them up, more than not, but if you whisper to someone in REM sleep, sometimes you get some incorporation of what you're saying in that verbal content into the dream. That's about the only known way to have any influence on a dream. In fact, this dream incubation that I'm telling you, your pre-sleep suggestion to yourself, or if somebody else were there in your room hypnotizing you and giving you suggestions to dream about this or that, that sort of verbal, before the dream is happening kind of suggestion is the most effective. Other questions?
I'm sorry, you have to cut in. We are running at a tight schedule. Professor Barrett would be holding a workshop at 4 o'clock at FC Kohli. There's registration desk at